All right, well, now we're going to turn to another pairing, and this is a pairing of two prose pieces, but one is fiction and one is nonfiction. Nicole, can we go to the next one, I think? We're going to look at two pieces here. One is from The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And so we have a novel, and then the other is from Fast Food Nation by Eric Schlosser. You're probably very familiar with the latter, and you may at some point have read parts of or have read the former. Robin was saying today that she remembers reading Upton Sinclair when she was 14. And I don't think it's taught in its entirety very much these days, but it's in some ways come back onto the scene because of Eric Schlosser and because of the work that he's done with the meatpacking industry. Mm-hmm. I want to start too by saying that pairing fiction and nonfiction, I think it's really important in the AP language class, because a lot of times students come to nonfiction, and many of us as teachers came to nonfiction saying, okay, well, this is what Louise Rosenblatt called efferent writing. This is just informational writing. That's what we've got. And the aesthetic reading is from fiction and poetry. The more you read nonfiction, of course, in these days there's been such magnificent nonfiction written. The more you read, you start to recognize that there's strategies. I mean, when we talk about rhetorical strategies, the rhetorical strategies are very, very similar. And I think this pairing demonstrates this. The pairing also demonstrates something else that's less literary and less rhetorical and less teacherly, and that is more political, and that is that there is a persistent problem. And this problem which we're looking at, which Upton Sinclair wrote about in the early part of the 1900s, still exists toward the very end of the century. And the pairing makes that point. Are these direct talkbacks? Not exactly, but sort of. And that is that obviously Upton Sinclair didn't know Schlosser, but Schlosser writes about Upton Sinclair and writes about the fact that he would be horrified to see that the problems that he wrote about still exist today in somewhat the same form, in fact. So it is a legitimate talkback in that way. But also I think the main point here is that they both are muckrakers. And we know that the term muckraker was popularized by Teddy Roosevelt. He used it in the 1906 speech actually to refer to journalists who were focusing mainly on the negative, and the term itself came from Pilgrim's Progress. But that notion of being a muckraker early in the century, later in the century, and of course Schlosser, we know, was also involved in the documentary Food, Inc., so he had another means or media available to him. I think that's really where I would start with this, two muckraking pieces. And then I would look a little bit at Sinclair and then go to Schlosser. What we're going to do here is to look only at a part of these two sections that are in CIA Lit. If you have the book, you'll see that they're longer excerpts. But just because we're going to be reading them here and talking about them, we just chose a few paragraphs from each one. Robin, you want to see what else you have to say and then get started on Sinclair?
Sure. What's interesting, too, of course, about The Jungle was that, we remember it as being so much about the meatpacking industry, but it was really about the experiences of this, immigrant family, Jurgis Rudkus. But the intent of the novel, I mean, it was certainly polemical, was to expose the harsh lives of immigrants, especially in a capitalist society. Probably remember that the public responded very viscerally to the descriptions of the industry, and reform, there was reform as a result in the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act by President Roosevelt in 1906. Apparently, Upton Sinclair was not happy about that because the reforms were going to come through taxpayer money, and I guess he was really against the owners of the business. But anyway, this chapter, this passage here is from Chapter 9, and it's interesting to read it. I mean, there are many, many different ways to look at it, but when I was looking at it recently, I was thinking about his audience. His audience and his subject are quite different in a way, and I guess that goes along with his purpose. So I'm going to read this out loud. Jurgis heard of these things little by little in the gossip of those who were obliged to perpetrate them. It seemed as if every time you met a person from a new department, you heard of new swindles and new crimes. There was, for instance, a Lithuanian who was a cattle butcher for the plant where Maria worked, which killed meat for canning only, and to hear this man describe the animals which came to his place would have been worthwhile for a Dante or a Zola. You see what I mean about audience. It seemed that they must have agencies all over the country to hunt out old and crippled and diseased cattle to be canned. There were cattle which had been fed on whiskey malt, the refuse of the breweries, and which had become what the men called steerly, which means covered with boils. It was a nasty job killing these, for when you plunged your knife into them, they would burst and splash foul-smelling stuff into your face. And when a man's sleeves were smeared with blood and his hands steeped in it, how was he ever to wipe his face or to clear his eyes so that he could see? It was such stuff such as this that made the, quote, embalmed beef that had killed several times as many United States soldiers as all the bullets of the Spaniards. Only the army beef, besides, was not fresh canned. It was old stuff that had been lying for years in the cellars. Then, one Sunday evening, Jurgis sat puffing his pipe by the kitchen stove and talking with an old fellow whom Jonas had introduced and who worked in the canning rooms at Durham's. And so Jurgis learned a few things about the great and only Durham canned goods, which had become a national institution. They were regular alchemists at Durham's. They advertised a mushroom catsup, and the men who made it did not know what a mushroom looked like. They advertised potted chicken, and it was like the boarding house soup of the comic papers through which a chicken had walked with rubbers on. Perhaps they had a secret process for making chickens chemically. Who knows, said Jurgis's friend. The things that went into the mixture were tripe, and the fat of pork, and beef suet, and the hearts of beef, and finally the waste ends of veal when they had any. They put these up in several grades and sold them at several prices, but the contents of the cans all came out of the same hopper. And then there was potted game and potted grouse, and deviled ham, deviled as the men called it. Deviled ham was made out of the waste ends of smoked beef that were too small to be sliced by the machines, and also tripe dyed with chemicals so that it would not show white, and trimmings of hams and corned beef and potatoes, skins and all, and finally the hard cartilaginous gullets of beef after the tongues had been cut out. All this ingenious mixture was ground up and flavored with spices to make it taste like something. Anybody who invented a new imitation had been sure of a fortune from old Durham, said Jurgis' informant. But it was hard to think of anything new in a place where so many sharp wits had been at work for so long, where men welcomed tuberculosis in the cattle they were feeding because it made them fatten more quickly, and where they bought up all the old rancid butter left over in the grocery stores of a continent and oxidized it by a forced air process to take away the odor, returned it with skim milk, and sold it back in the cities. Sold it in bricks in the cities. Up to a year ago, it had been the custom to kill horses in the yards, ostensibly for fertilizer. But after long agitation, the newspapers had been able to make the public realize that the horses were being canned. Now it was against the law to kill horses in Packingtown, and the law was really complied with for the present at any rate. Any day, however, one might see sharp-horned and shaggy-haired creatures running with the sheep. And yet what a job you would have to get the public to believe that a good part of what it buys for lamb and mutton is really goat's flesh. There was another interesting set of statistics that a person might have gathered in Packingtown. Those are the various afflictions of the workers. When Jurgis had first inspected the packing plants with Svedvilas, he had marveled while listening to the tale of all the things that were made out of the carcasses of animals and of all the lesser industries that were maintained there. Now he found that each one of these lesser industries was a separate little inferno, in its way as horrible as the killing beds, the source and fountain of them all. The workers in each of them had their own peculiar diseases, and the wandering visitor might be skeptical about all the swindles. But he could not be skeptical about these, for the worker bore the evidence of them about on his person. Generally, he had only to hold out his hand. So pretty grim. Again, the language is sophisticated. He's writing to an educated audience, certainly, with Dante and Zola. He's not writing for the subjects of the workers, certainly. and he certainly doesn't stint on details. So, Renee, maybe you want to talk a little bit about Eric Schlosser now, and then we can talk a little bit about how to work with the two texts together.